For most of history, the world has organized itself around a dominant currency. And for the people living inside that system, it always feels permanent. Not because it truly is, but because daily life continues to function. Prices still update, salaries still arrive, markets still open each morning. Stability becomes a habit, and habits are easy to mistake for guarantees. That's why the end of a reserve currency is almost never recognized in real time. Collapse, as people imagine it, is an event, a moment, a shock, a headline. But reserve currencies don't end that way. They unwind through processes, slow adjustments, policy responses that feel reasonable in isolation, small distortions that accumulate without triggering alarm. History shows that dominant monetary systems rarely announce their decline. They normalize it, and by the time the change becomes visible, the outcome is already locked in. Because reserve currencies don't fail suddenly, they fail predictably. What a reserve currency actually is, and what it isn't. A reserve currency is often described as something the world trusts. But that explanation is backward. Trust is not the foundation of reserve status. It's the result of a system that works, for a time, better than the alternatives. Functionally, a reserve currency is the unit used to settle trade, price commodities, and store surplus value across borders. It becomes embedded in contracts, supply chains, and balance sheets, not because it is virtuous, but because it is convenient, liquid, and enforceable. Once enough transactions depend on it, switching away becomes costly, which is what creates stability. But that stability carries an obligation. The issuing nation must supply the world with its currency in sufficient quantity to meet global demand. That means running persistent external deficits. It means exporting financial claims instead of finished goods. And it means tolerating imbalances that would be unacceptable for any non-reserve economy. Over time, domestic policy stops serving internal productivity and starts serving external liquidity needs. The currency's global role begins to override local economic health. What once looked like privilege slowly becomes constraint. And that obligation doesn't disappear. It compounds until it becomes a structural trap. The trade deficit paradox, or how strength becomes fragility. For a reserve currency to function, it has to leave its home country. The rest of the world needs access to it, not occasionally, but continuously. And the primary way a currency spreads globally is through trade imbalances. Reserve currency issuers don't export dominance through goods alone. They export their currency. Other nations send real products and labor in exchange for financial claims, bonds, deposits, and settlement balances denominated in that reserve unit. What appears as a trade deficit is, in reality, the mechanism that keeps the global system liquid. This is why chronic trade deficits are not policy accidents. They are structural requirements. Britain experienced this as sterling dominated global trade before the First World War. The United States inherited the same dynamic after 1971, when gold convertibility ended and the dollar became purely credit-based. For decades, these deficits are manageable because foreign demand absorbs the excess currency. Capital flows back into the issuer's financial markets, suppressing interest rates and reinforcing the system. But this balance depends on scale and confidence. The first real signal emerges when deficits grow faster than the system's ability to absorb them, and adjustment stops being voluntary. Signal number 1, debt stops being cyclical and becomes permanent. In healthy systems, debt is cyclical. It expands during periods of investment or crisis, then contracts as growth restores balance. Productive debt creates capacity, infrastructure, technology, expansion that eventually pays for itself. Structural debt does not. Reserve currency nations gradually cross that line. Because global demand for their currency suppresses borrowing costs, there is little immediate penalty for running deficits. Debt no longer functions as a temporary tool. It becomes a permanent feature of governance. Recessions add to it, recoveries fail to reduce it, and crises reset the baseline higher each time. At that point, deleveraging becomes politically and economically impossible. Cutting spending risks destabilizing both domestic growth and global liquidity. Raising taxes threatens capital flight, so repayment quietly disappears as an objective. What replaces it is rollover. Old debt is never retired, it is refinanced, extended, absorbed into larger balance sheets. This is not a failure of discipline, it is the only way the system remains functional. Rome followed this path through currency debasement as military spending outpaced revenues. Britain financed empire and war through perpetual borrowing long after trade surpluses faded. Debt alone doesn't kill a reserve currency. How that debt is financed does. Monetization replaces financing. As long as debt can be financed externally, the system holds. Foreign buyers absorb issuance, markets set interest rates, and borrowing still carries discipline. But, reserve currency systems don't break at the moment debt becomes large. They shift when demand for that debt weakens. When foreign appetite slows, central banks step in, not abruptly and rarely with alarm. Initially, it's framed as temporary support, liquidity management, or market stabilization. But over time, borrowing gives way to creation. Financing quietly becomes monetization. Balance sheet expansion stops being an emergency measure and starts to feel, routine. Asset purchases extend beyond crises. Interventions last longer, unwind less, and return faster with each disruption. What was once extraordinary becomes operational. The critical change isn't the size of the balance sheet, it's who sets the price of money. When central banks become the marginal buyer, markets lose their ability to discipline the issuer. Interest rates stop reflecting risk and start reflecting policy intent. At that point, money no longer transmits accurate signals. Capital allocation distorts. Speculation outperforms productivity, and incentives across the economy begin to tilt in subtle but persistent ways. This is where the system still looks stable, but behaves differently, and that shift changes price signals everywhere. Signal number 2. Asset inflation detaches from real productivity. When monetary expansion accelerates, its first destination is rarely the consumer economy. New liquidity enters through financial channels, banks, markets, asset purchases, not wages. As a result, inflation shows up first where money arrives first, in assets. Stocks, real estate, and financial instruments rise faster than output or productivity. On paper, wealth appears to grow. Balance sheets strengthen. Confidence holds. But this growth is detached from the real economy's capacity to produce goods and services. Prices rise not because value has increased, but because currency supply has. This creates a powerful illusion. Asset owners feel richer, while those dependent on income feel left behind. Consumption remains stable for a time, masking the divergence. Traditional inflation metrics understate the imbalance, reinforcing the belief that the system is healthy. Inequality, in this phase, is not primarily a moral failure or a policy accident. It's a monetary signal. It indicates where newly created money concentrates and where it doesn't. Late-stage reserve systems consistently reward the holding of existing assets over the creation of new value. Returns flow upward, while productivity stagnates beneath the surface. At this stage, stability still looks like prosperity. But it isn't. The credibility gap, or when numbers replace trust. As imbalances grow, confidence becomes harder to sustain organically. Trust, once built through consistent outcomes, is gradually replaced by explanations. Governments and institutions lean more heavily on statistics to demonstrate stability, even as lived experience begins to diverge from reported conditions. Metrics like CPI, GDP growth, and employment figures take on outsized importance. Each release becomes a reassurance exercise. Methodologies adjust, narratives sharpen. The system doesn't lie outright, it reframes. Numbers are technically accurate, but increasingly incomplete. They measure what is manageable, not what is meaningful. This is how credibility gaps form, not through a single failure, but through accumulated dissonance. When official indicators improve while purchasing power, opportunity, or mobility stagnate, trust erodes quietly. People adapt, but they remember. History shows this process is non-linear. Britain's post-war decline followed decades of managed narratives, capital controls, and statistical justification before sterling finally lost reserve relevance. The break didn't come when weakness first appeared. It came when explanations stopped convincing. Once trust weakens, systems don't immediately collapse. They compensate. Oversight increases. Rules multiply. Transparency is promised, but discretion expands. And that's when control mechanisms begin to grow. Signal number 3. Capital controls without the name. Capital controls are often imagined as sudden bans, frozen accounts, closed borders, overt restrictions. But in advanced reserve systems, they rarely appear that way. Control arrives gradually, through friction rather than force. Modern capital restrictions are procedural. Reporting thresholds tighten, transfer delays increase. Compliance requirements expand. Access is not denied, but slowed, monitored, and conditioned. Each measure is defensible on its own, framed as risk management, transparency, or consumer protection. This distinction matters. Regulatory friction changes behavior without triggering panic. Most people comply because the system still functions, just less freely than before. Over time, moving capital becomes more complex, more expensive, and more visible. Coercion isn't necessary when participation is mandatory. Compliance replaces enforcement because alternatives quietly disappear. Financial life becomes embedded within approved channels, where deviation carries administrative cost rather than legal threat. The early warning signs are easy to misread. Safeguards, anti-fraud rules, stability measures. Few object because each step seems reasonable in isolation. But collectively, they indicate something deeper. Capital is no longer being encouraged to move efficiently. It's being encouraged to stay, and that signals the system is no longer expanding. It's defending itself. The global exit phase, or what foreign holders do first. Foreign holders experience reserve currency systems differently than domestic populations. They're not anchored by wages, pensions, or political narratives. Their exposure is really just transactional. When incentives change, they adjust quickly. As returns compress and risks rise, the exit rarely looks dramatic. Central banks reduce marginal purchases. Sovereign funds rebalance quietly. Trade partners adjust settlement terms, shortening maturities or increasing collateral. None of this requires public statements. It shows up in flows, not headlines. Reserves begin to shift away from pure currency holdings toward real assets, commodities, infrastructure, strategic equity, or into alternative settlement arrangements that reduce reliance on a single unit. Bilateral trade agreements expand. Currency swaps replace open market dependence. The system fragments without announcing itself. This phase is easy to miss because nothing breaks. Markets remain liquid. Prices hold. The reserve currency still dominates by inertia alone, but its role becomes more symbolic than functional at the margin. Domestic populations, insulated by familiarity, notice last. By the time concern spreads publicly, the strategic adjustments have already occurred elsewhere. Positioning precedes perception, and by the time the public reacts, the exit is already complete. Why collapse rarely looks like collapse. Reserve currencies rarely collapse in the way people expect. Hyperinflation is the exception, not the rule. For systems at the center of global finance, adjustment is absorbed, distributed, and delayed. As external demand softens, decline enters a plateau phase. Purchasing power erodes unevenly. Living standards stagnate rather than crash. Financial markets remain functional because liquidity is still abundant, even if its quality deteriorates. The system feels strained, but not broken. Technology plays a critical role in masking this phase. Efficiency gains reduce visible shortages. Automation compresses labor costs. Digital markets increase price competition and transparency, slowing consumer inflation even as monetary expansion continues. These forces extend the illusion of control. At the same time, complexity rises. Supply chains lengthen. Financial instruments multiply. Risk is redistributed across layers rather than eliminated. This delays reckoning but increases fragility. The result is a system that appears resilient while becoming increasingly dependent on intervention. Stability is maintained through constant adjustment, not underlying strength. This is why late-stage reserve decline is so often misunderstood. People look for collapse and see continuity, but continuity is not permanence, it's delay. The end state, loss of privilege, not annihilation. A reserve currency does not vanish when its era ends. It continues to circulate, to function, and to serve domestic needs. What disappears is its status, the privilege of being the default medium for global trade, savings, and settlement. When dominance fades, it isn't replaced by a single successor. It fragments. Regional systems emerge. Trade settles in multiple currencies. Bilateral agreements replace universal standards. Power disperses, and with it, the ease that once came from issuing the world's primary unit of account. History is consistent on this point. Sterling didn't collapse after losing reserve status, it adapted. Britain remained a major economy, but without the structural advantage that allowed it to finance deficits cheaply and project influence effortlessly. The adjustment was gradual, but it was real. Former reserve issuers face tighter constraints. Capital becomes more selective. Policy mistakes carry faster consequences. Living standards recalibrate to productivity rather than privilege. For nations, this is a strategic shift. For individuals, it's something else entirely. States can renegotiate systems, taxes, and trade relationships. Individuals don't have that luxury. They face a different question: how to navigate a world where monetary advantage is no longer automatic. The strategic insight most people miss. The greatest risk in reserve currency decline is not monetary, it's behavioral. Systems change slowly enough that people assume continuity means safety. They anchor decisions to what has worked before, long after the conditions that made it work have shifted. This is the hidden cost of dominance. When a system rewards passive participation for generations, adaptation feels unnecessary, even irresponsible. By the time adjustment becomes obvious, flexibility has already narrowed. Reserve currencies don't fail people. They simply stop compensating for poor positioning. The world doesn't become unlivable, but it becomes less forgiving. Margins tighten, errors compound, assumptions carry weight. Those who struggle most are not those without resources, but those without awareness. History doesn't punish ignorance immediately. It erodes advantage quietly, then enforces reality without negotiation. Stability in monetary systems has never meant permanence. It has always meant a temporary condition, one that eventually expires.